I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. Today, Nir and I are going to talk about Supersoldiers.
Yep. What are Supersoldiers?
Well, I think it's a transitional topic, really, because as we get humanoid robots and other kinds of robots in the war fighting arena, as they're already coming, eventually robots are going to be cheaper and better than soldiers in war fighting. But there are other kinds of super soldier enhancements of communication and battlefield capacities and so forth that are still probably applicable. But in the meantime, I think the thing is, can you make somebody a better killer on a battlefield? Can they get up if they get shot? Can you enhance them so that they are physically resistant to violence? Can you enhance their communication ability so that they're tuned into what's actually going on the battlefield and what their fellow soldiers are doing? Can you choose who should be a soldier in the first place so that you know that they're not going to get PTSD? Or can you suppress PTSD by giving them the right kind of drugs? There's all kinds of applications here. I think it's a fascinating set of questions.
Yeah. So the project is creating the most efficient soldiering machine possible. So the kind of use of enhancement and technology in the service of essentially military efficiency, but focusing on human beings rather than on necessarily as the ultimate military tool, rather than on giving them the best tools, as it were.
Right. I mean, I think there are some enhancement of communication and things like that were talked about in this report.
Right. And our curiosity about this was piqued by a report that we'll link to in the show notes that was put out by the British Ministry of Defense in collaboration with the German Army, or the German Ministry of Defense, on Supersoldiers. And, one of the things that struck me the most when I read that was this insistence on viewing soldiers as platforms to be enhanced, a little bit like an iPhone that can, get all kinds of plugs into it.
They were fairly explicit about that. I thought that was interesting. Yeah.
That I have to say that I think the discussion is fascinating. That kind of rubbed me a little bit the wrong way, as a little bit being, too instrumental to humans. If humans are platforms, then if you come up with a platform that's different, you can dispense with them.
I think that's a good place to start, actually, for the kind of philosophical discussion, because one of the big concerns always with research on soldiers, whether it's like vaccines for soldiers who are going into do different countries, or whatever you do to soldiers, it's always been they don't have a choice. So there's no informed consent, and militaries are often rushing things into soldiers before they're well understood. So I think that's a good place to start the discussion. I mean, do you think that militaries can experiment on soldiers in ways that are ethical?
Yeah, that's a great question. Even when they do have a choice, right? Even in volunteer army situations, it's not clear if the choice is about joining or not joining, or about everything that happens once you do join. Certainly, it's the case that a military's project is not, whatever they say, is not the well-being of the soldier. It's winning.
Right.
And so, look, descriptively speaking, as you say, there's been a lot more experiments on soldiers with a lot less scrutiny than experiments on people, even when we're talking about, Western militaries. Mm-hmm. And I guess part of the justification is a reason of state, right? Morally, I don't think it's a very complicated question, I guess.
You agree that the interests of the collective can outweigh the interests of a soldier, and therefore a draft?
No. Well, no. I mean, most of the time, I think there needs to be. That's a really good question. I guess unless there's a very demonstrable supreme emergency in which some kind of testing needs to be taken very, very quickly, I think there needs to be informed consent in that context as well. So just as a sort of project of, enhancing soldiers to win a putative future war with the Chinese, I don't think you can start playing with people's brains without asking them or giving them, enhancement drugs without asking
I think
them.
that's right. I mean, I think the intuition there is that you could agree with situations where you're going to send 10 guys to certain death in order to serve some larger military purpose.
Right.
But you wouldn't give them vaccines that you know nothing about, because how would that serve the military purpose? It's hard to imagine a circumstance in which you would want to roll out untested medicines on soldiers,
and yet that does happen.
It does happen, yeah.
It
happened during Desert
happen.
Storm when the first Iraq War. There was a cocktail of things that made soldiers sick, and they got mad about it. Yeah.
It happened during Desert Storm. I know there's some cases of it in IDF history. I'm sure there's
Agent Orange
exposures
during Vietnam.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure there's examples of it in other armies. I mean, I guess there's this sort of background sense going on there that while you're a soldier, somehow you're almost by definition, your individual projects and interests don't count as much as when you're not a soldier. Like the translation of the famous sort of war as hell, Walzer talks about this in his famous book about the ethics of war. The translation of the famous war as hell adage is that it's hell because it's the one context in a liberal democratic kind of life where it's not all about what you want and what you want to get out of life and your own projects, but about subsuming them to the state. So the military in itself, I guess, is broadly seen, or the soldiers are seen by military officials and security officials as a utility, and utilities you tinker with and you play with. So I think that's broadly the kind of mindset that allows for this.
Well, we may be flipping our scripts here, but I'm not a pacifist. I think militaries are an essential role in the modern world and police fighting.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, for me, the question of military technologies and the rights of soldiers always come back to how much can you defend individual rights here without impairing the larger mission? What's that balance? And I think as we were struggling towards, there's a balance that says it's very unlikely that there'll be a situation where you want to rush untested, medical treatments out on soldiers. I don't think that this is a situation. I don't think there's any, I don't think the U.S. military is anxious to start opening up soldiers' heads and putting brain computer.
No, I don't think so either.
Right.
I'm also not a pacifist, and I actually think that practically speaking, experimentation and enhancement without informed consent is probably not the most common scenario. Yeah. And actually, I don't think that's what raises the most central questions here. It does happen. I think it's pretty straightforwardly wrong in most of the cases when it happens, unless there's, really some kind of supreme emergency that would have to kind of be justified ex post facto.
Right.
I think what's in some ways more interesting is that whether from patriotic reasons or other motivations, most soldiers, or self-interest and self-preservation, soldiers would agree and be excited about being enhanced.
Right. I think there may be hype, nationalistic fervor, hype, other reasons why people would agree to do things to themselves that they might regret.
Yeah. Let's maybe just do a sort of catalog for a moment about for some forms to discuss some forms of enhancement. It's an old practice, so I mean, I guess one I'm thinking about the forms I'm familiar with. One is drugs, whether they are downers that will make it easier to tolerate the horrors of war, or uppers that will make you able to function for longer.
A practice which probably goes back to the dawn of time. Get liquored up and then go beat on it the next village. Yeah.
Right. So, but liquored up or marijuana, etc., would be sort of
hashishim.
More. Right. Those would be the more downers. The uppers would be more like the methamphetamines that the Nazis famously were on during the Blitz stage.
Civil War soldiers paid in rum.
Civil War soldiers paid in rum, exactly. A more recent practice is I know anabolic steroids are often used to counteract sleep deprivation, stress, low caloric intake, brain injury. So just the use of steroid to sort of overcome the natural processes in the body that come from those kind of stresses.
Do you remember 15 years ago there was a case of U.S. military jet pilot who was doing an exercise over the Alps, and he clipped one of the lines of a gondola in the Alps, and it turned out that he had been awake for like 24 hours on amphetamines.
Oh, wow.
But I remember that case clearly because the Navy and the Air Force have been looking into giving pilots. Well, they've been giving pilots amphetamines for a long time, but they've been looking into giving them modafinil instead, which doesn't have some of the same downsides. And so, yeah, at any rate, that guy was on amphetamines, and that got the Air Force in trouble. So,
Yeah.
I think the idea of chemical enhancement of soldiers, ancient and just going to get better and better. But the kinds of things that we talk about in the emerging tech field is not just being immune to pain, but also like being immune to PTSD. That's one of the things that the enhancement debate started to debate when the President's Council Beyond Therapy came out. Because they said in there, we've got these propranolol therapies for memory. And it turns out that if you dose people up with propranolol when they have a traumatic event,
That's like a beta blocker?
It is a beta blocker, yeah.
Yeah.
And it keeps you from developing as much PTSD. So is that a good idea or a bad idea, for a soldier not to be able to get PTSD? I think it's a good idea, but I can see it a lot depends. I mean, I think the whole thing rewinds to, do you agree with the ethics of any particular intervention? Because if you don't agree with the ethics of the intervention, you want the soldiers to get PTSD. And if you do, you don't, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two questions there, right? If you don't get PTSD, you are able to continue fighting under some conditions where you potentially shouldn't, right? It kind of makes you more of a Superman, or more able to tolerate what normal people can't tolerate. And so it removes a limitation on fighting. It makes war more violent than it has to be, or makes you better at war than you otherwise would be. But also, it kind of then you stop taking the propranolol and you go back to regular capabilities, supposedly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the other aspect of this, except for making war more vicious or longer than it would otherwise be, is what happens to you when you come home and you're like, shit, I have the ability not to be traumatized by events? Do you then like just continue self-medicating with propranolol, or do you like always think back nostalgically about the good old days when you wouldn't get PTSD from what normally gives people PTSD? So it's not like the change is limited to your wartime.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think there's a category of questions here about.
Is that an issue?
Yeah. And I think there's a category of questions about what you do with soldiers after they are discharged, or after they're demobilized, or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Especially if you like do things like brain computer interfaces or gene therapies or something like that to them. You wouldn't want superpowered individuals. This is the superhero scenario. Somebody's walking down the street and they can blow up a building with their eyes or whatever. You wouldn't want superpowered individuals to just be part of society.
Yeah, I mean the bigger project, if we go back to the context of war, is to sort of reduce the cost of war for a specific soldier, right? Like PTSD is a cost of war. You reduce it, they can fight more war. But does that, like, you make war less terrible for that person? They can fight it longer. It's not like the damage that they're gonna inflict is smaller. So morally, you're basically making what's terrible not terrible. The argument being the war is important enough to win. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
Well, I think that's why the whole thing starts with the question of whether there can be just conflicts. If you think it's a just conflict or a defensible conflict, then it's a different question.
Well, the just war theorists distinguish between whether the conflict is just and whether your actions within it are just. The jus ad bellum and the jus in bello, as it were, distinction. So the question here would kind of be, even if it is the paradigm of, the just conflict, the Allies' war against the Nazis and the Japanese in World War II, does anything go in a just conflict? And we tend to assume that no, and that those two questions are separate. So I'm assuming that enhancement to not feel PTSD would kind of fall under the sort of jus in bello questions of justice in the conduct of war as opposed to the justice of the cause.
Do you think preventing PTSD would be in that category?
Well, it kind of depends why you're preventing it, right? If you're preventing it so that people can, like
Do
PTSD
atrocities.
comes around from. Right, yeah. If you're preventing it to make sure that people can, sort of do atrocities without suffering moral injury and recurring sort of nightmares afterwards, then yes, for sure. If it's so that they, can go back to combat more quickly, after seeing terrible things or after having their friends die next to them, then it's a more complicated question. I mean, like being traumatized from almost dying and seeing your friends die seems like a natural response. I know you don't like the category of natural very much, but
Well, but I think you're agreeing with me that the ethics of the PTSD therapy is determined by the ethics of the intervention, right? If the intervention's unethical, then it's unethical to prevent PTSD in that situation. So, right? Isn't that what you're saying? So the first question is it an ethical conflict?
Is it yeah, but even in an ethical conflict, there's ethical and not ethical conduct.
Yeah.
So the fact that the conflict is ethical doesn't, just sanitize all conduct within it.
So nuclear weapons, unethical technology because they necessarily kill lots of innocent civilians, right? So there are certain technologies we shouldn't use even in an ethical conflict.
That's been part of the argument. I mean, again, that was certainly the argument around the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the counter argument has been that the war would not have ended otherwise.
Which I'm not necessarily endorsing.
Surrendered otherwise. Yeah, I'm just stating what the argument was, and so there it was sort of the ultimate, focus on the cause. Traditionally, people have said you have to separate the justness of the cause and the justness of the means, and that they are logically independent from each other, those two questions. You can have a just war fought unjustly, and you can have an unjust war fought within acceptable bounds, etc., etc. I mean, I don't think there's been a ton of work actually looking at enhancement as a question of the morality of the means. I think one question that comes up here is like preventing PTSD by enhancement. I'm assuming you'd either propranolol or some kind of maybe brain stimulation or what have you. It seems like a variety of eliminating pain. It seems like a sort of subcategory of like if you could create a fighter who didn't feel pain, so that they could more easily help you win a war, would that be justified? And again, it goes back to the point you were making. On the one hand, if it's really, really important to win this, war against an absolutely terrible foe, and this could give you an advantage, then yes, of course, there's an argument for it. But pain, including the psychic pain of PTSD, has an important evolutionary function, which is you stop doing stuff that's going to kill you, right? That you kind of recoil from stuff.
You think turning off your response to physical injury in the battlefield is going to make you less averse to getting shot by guns or something like that? I mean, it just makes you more likely to get up.
It's like in that Monty Python thing of the dude like jumping on one leg, saying just a flesh wound, right? I mean, if you keep running with terrible injuries and you're bleeding out because you don't feel pain, you're gonna die. So yeah, there's an evolution. There's a very important both evolutionary and moral argument for taking pain seriously. It seems like PTSD to me is under that category, isn't it?
I don't think anybody needs PTSD to learn moral lessons about the world, but I can see why people believe that might be important.
Well, Well, no, but wanting to avoid PTSD in the first place is going to have a moderating effect on how you behave. Just like wanting to avoid having your hand burned is going to keep you away from the stove.
Who is walking around trying to avoid PTSD? You're trying to avoid the situations in which you would get PTSD.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So you're saying people would be less averse to avoiding situations.
PTSD is a known cost of war, right? So it would make a soldier in as far. I mean, first of all, it's going to come with war for so many of its fighters anyway. But just like people don't want to be killed, they don't want to come back home traumatized for the rest of their lives. They're going to be more careful as a result of the fear of it happening. And if the fear of it happening is eliminated technologically, they're going to be less careful. They're going to be fiercer. You have soldiers with a different, in all of these cases, I guess what I'm saying is you have soldiers with a different risk calculation who would more readily headlong jump into harm's way because they know that they can be harmed in fewer ways.
Well, that's all plausible, I suppose. That having too many soldiers who are fearless in the battlefield could lead to irrational behavior or something like that. And that would have to be observed just to see what's happening. But I suspect that what we're, at best, I would imagine that you would give soldiers the choice of whether to avoid PTSD by taking certain drugs or not. And but okay, so that's one possible thing. Let's take some things off the table. Do you think there's any ethical issues with soldiers using exoskeletons? I don't. I think it's like riding in a Jeep or a tank.
I don't, but let me go back one moment because there's a distinction that we didn't make, and that distinction is it's one thing to medicate a soldier to avoid PTSD so that they can come back to battle more quickly and so that they don't feel it in the either immediate presence or aftermath of the battle. And it's another thing to give a veteran who comes home and is always sitting against the wall and is jumpy from noises and is violent with their family medication that would make the PTSD go away. The second case, I think, is completely uncontroversial. The first case is an instrumental use of the medicine so that you squeeze more out of the soldier. And it's more controversial. It's not that it would never be allowed, but it's more controversial. Does that make sense as a distinction?
Yeah, except that practically the therapy has to be given at the time of the trauma, at the moment of the trauma. So you can't make a distinction between post-battle therapy and current battle therapy. But
so this brings up a question that I'm sure, or a problem that I'm sure that we'll talk about more, that in many of these cases, the therapy and the enhancement are very, very close to each other.
I think that's a general, I'm totally fine with that observation. I'm willing to take the category of enhancement off the table in general. Just say there are things that are better for people and things that are worse. It's better for people not to experience as much pain. It's better for people to be more resilient to injury, et cetera, et cetera. I don't see any of these as necessarily problematic because they're enhancements.
I guess just to summarize that point, trauma is an awful cost of war, and it's also part of why people are weary of it. And technologically being able to eliminate it is both important and is going to result in less caution about fighting wars.
Right. So that's a general observation. People make that point also about autonomous lethal robotics, that you could imagine a tyrant in control of an army of robots and he wouldn't need any soldiers to agree with him. He could just control the country that way. But so
not seeing the connection.
Oh, well, the safer and easier it is to exercise military power, the more of a threat of unaccountable military power. At least people think that that's the case because they think human soldiers can be mobilized against a tyrant or something like that. That doesn't happen very often, but it's theoretically possible. It's more imaginable than with robots. But so in the cases of soldiers who are invincible, right, you have the same problem. If you would only need half as many, and everyone would fear them, and you'd become a tyrant.
Right. The question would be, so there's the arms race issue here, right? If the Chinese and the Russians were creating, if we really knew that they're creating soldiers who are invincible, that would change our calculation about whether to create soldiers who are invincible ourselves. On the other hand, do you want to be the first party to introduce soldiers who are invincible onto the battlefield? And those are two separate questions, right?
I think to the second, almost all armies would say, yes, I do want to be the first to introduce invincible soldiers on the battlefield. But I think the question, as we've been alluding, the question is, are they actually invincible? Are they actually good soldiers? Are they doing what they're supposed to? China's, as you've alluded, China is very interested in super soldier technology and in general in human enhancement in ways that we are more cautious about in the West. And so I do think that this is a concern for our military challenges with China, that they may introduce some of these super soldier things quicker than we do.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's a whole sort of neighborhood of the argument that I just started making earlier. If you make first of all, there's no such thing as invincible, but if you make a more invincible or a more robust soldier, right, you, first of all, enhance your prospects for military achievement as long as you have an advantage, as you were suggesting earlier, which is why a lot of armies are going to want that, regardless of their political orientation. You're making the costs of war lower, at least for a while. You're making people change their risk calculation and as a result be more gung-ho. If I knew that I could not possibly be hit by a car, I would run into the road a lot more frequently than I do because it would save me time. I guess a second order question is, are you, by doing that, by both cognitively and physically enhancing your soldiers to be smarter, more perceptive, more powerful, faster, need less leaf, blah, 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 are you changing any of your traditional conceptions of heroism and military virtue, all of which depend on the fact that the things are hard, that most people can't do them, that they require a degree of excellence? Does that matter, or are we just like moving the bar maybe?
For me, the Ukraine conflict has kind of underlined a lot of my opinions about these things, like about autonomous drones. If you're an 18-year-old Ukrainian guy, the government says you can't leave the country and you have to go fight at the front, and they want to give you drugs that make you a better soldier. I don't think I'm not worried about Zelensky wanting to then invade Moldova. It's like this is the risk here is not that this is encouraging militarism on the part of the Ukrainian government. Nor am I terribly concerned that these soldiers are going to turn around and say, "Oh, am I really a hero if I had to take a drug to treat my PTSD?" I'm not concerned about that either.
Mm-hmm. So your concern is really what kind of regime uses enhancements in the first place. The kind of enhancements don't really matter that much to you.
I want the enhancements to not cause a lot of collateral damage in other ways, and that would be, can they be turned off when you become a civilian? Are there serious consequences when you're a civilian again? Do they actually improve collateral damage on the battlefield, things like that?
Yeah. By the way, the heroism point is a sociological observation rather than a good or bad kind of thing. The kinds of technologies we introduce into the battlefield change our conception of what is and what isn't military achievement. So as more and more killing from the air is done by drones without taking without taking risks in the process of doing so, killing from the air becomes less and less noteworthy. The drone pilots sitting in a caravan in Arizona aren't considered to be, brave fighter pilots. By the way, they suffer quite a bit. They get PTSD, to the previous discussion, in higher rates than regular pilots do, et cetera, et cetera. So the kind of technology that we introduce into the battlefield does change the sort of sociological parameters in which we see soldiers.
Sure, but you ask that soldier or their family, this guy in Yemen needs to be killed. We could give you a gun and send you over there to try to shoot them, or we could give you a drone and you could stay here in Las Vegas and shoot them from here. What do you think they're going to choose? Of course they're going to choose to stay home and shoot them from the air.
I'm not sure you're right. I'm far from sure that you're right. Part of
any soldier who wants to go to Yemen is an idiot. I mean, that's
well, they don't go to Yemen because that was always their dream. They go to Yemen in the name of being sent to Yemen as part of their patriotic duty. If we're kind of speaking in that kind of highfalutin language.
Okay, so I think this is fundamental. You believe in something called martial valor that has value, right? And I don't. I don't think that people should be aspiring to martial valor.
Well, wait a minute. If there's such a thing as just war, then there should be, and most wars are not, and some are. Then there should be honor and recognition and respect that are attached to the people who are willing to take a risk and risk their lives for it. And if to the extent that they're risking their lives less and less because of technology, there's going to be less and less honor involved because honor and danger are connected to each other.
The Air Force is intrinsically less valorous than infantry. I mean, what people have to be putting their lives on the line?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that about the Air Force because it's incredibly dangerous, but piloting drones is intrinsically less valorous, and that's creating all kinds of serious psychological issues for the drone pilots because they, pilot the drones, then they go shopping and stop and shop at the end of the shift, and that whiplash of moving in and out of sort of battle immersion is very psychologically disorienting to them. So, I mean, I will say historically, actually, yes, all the way back to Pericles' funeral oration, there's this intrinsic connection between danger and honor, or danger and, want to use that old word, glory. And to the extent that I just don't think that the technologies we have take away danger completely, but they kind of change the danger calculus. They change what counts as danger to the extent that they make war fighting not dangerous or significantly less dangerous. I think they're completely changing the nature of war.
Well, let me just say, I'm not willing to take into my ethical calculation about the use of a technology in the battlefield, whether it helps soldiers feel sexy about being soldiers or not.
It's not about sexy, though. It has nothing to do with. I mean, it's not really. I don't think you're taking the argument seriously.
I'm not.
I think
I do not take seriously the argument that we should be trying to preserve martial valor. We're not trying to preserve martial valor. I'm just saying the idea, descriptively speaking, the idea of martial valor is necessary for people to go fight. Nobody's going to go into wars without social recognition that comes with it. Sounds like a good reason to automate the whole thing, so that we don't have to rely on absurd value commitments and emotional bundles of craziness.
Yeah,
my grandpappy fought in the Civil War, therefore I have to go die for my country. Why do we want to rely on that? That's dumb.
Well, because in the end, it is going to be dangerous, and people deserve recognition for taking a risk. And if you think that you can, first of all, I don't think you can automate the whole thing. That's an old dream. I mean, Gatling, who invented the machine gun, thought that, with the invention of these kind of, remarkable tools for the automation of war, then there would be less people fighting it. And now we're talking about like a contemporary version of the same idea of like laser beams from space and all kinds of nonsense like that. That's been the dream forever of automating war.
500,000 Americans died in the Civil War. 55,000 died in our interventions in Iraq. So the cost of war in terms of soldiers' lives has been going down systematically.
We sent less people to Iraq significantly.
yes, but the danger of a soldier dying in conflicts has been declining. And that's
Yeah,
because our technology is getting better. Our value on soldiers' lives is getting
that's great.
higher.
I'm just saying you won't get. I mean, I don't think we disagree as much as you think. I don't think you're going to be able to get war without danger. I think there's no technological solution that is going to take danger out of war. And what I am saying, both historically and descriptively, is that the willingness to take a risk is the basis for military honor. And what I am arguing, I think, pretty strongly, is that there's going to be no way to divorce war from military honor. There's not going to be a technological solution to that.
As long as there's a soldier who has to hold a gun, I agree. But that so okay. So let's get back to the technologies.
Wait. So you see, so you do see a future in which overlords send each other's robots to fight with each other.
My vision of an ideal world is one in which
Are robots fighting the Russian robots?
it's one in which everything is a police action and there's no more war. That we have global enforceable world law.
God help me.
But so short of that, and in order to get there,
The Kantian post-humanist.
short of that, in order to get there, you do need the right kind of militaries to protect the world.
Well, going back to a question you asked me earlier, by the way, so we're trying to kind of narrow the scope of disagreement, like with looking at the technologies, and you asked about exoskeletons.
Just to take things off the table, I don't consider them ethical.
Yeah. No, I don't. And so an exoskeleton, just to explain to our listeners, would be some kind of external support structure that a soldier would wear on their back and on their legs that would help them run faster and carry heavier weights. So I mean, we've been doing that forever in more primitive ways. I don't see a problem with that, nor do I see a problem with advanced armors, etc., etc. Yeah, I mean, all of these have in the end, the point of all military technology is either to make fighting easier or to make the cost of fighting more tolerable. And certainly exoskeletons, yeah, we can take that
Okay.
Off the table.
Okay, good. Powered and passive exoskeletons. It was on their list here. Brain interfaces. I think you probably agree with me that it's a problem if we give soldiers a brain interface and then they go back into civilian life. But it kind of depends on
what would a brain interface.
Yeah.
So let's just again. So for people who are not versed in this, give us an example of what that would look like.
One of the examples that people have been thinking about and experimenting on a long time is if there's some way for fighter pilots to be more immediately connected or more intimately tied to the operating of a jet. And I don't think that there's been, so far as I can tell, of course it's probably secret, but I don't think there's been a lot of progress. But if we imagine something like Neuralink's little coin stuck on a soldier's head, they could have direct connection between themselves and the operating of a piece of equipment. And I think that you could imagine that being quite effective as a technology. I think there's obviously a learning curve trying to figure out how to do stuff with your brain, but
yeah. So the ability, I think one thing people talk about is the ability to kind of intuitively control a swarm of drones and not be dependent on the limitations of a joystick or of a crappy screen that can crack of an iPad or something like that.
There's a line of DoD research that I've been fascinated by for more than a decade, which is called augmented cognition or AugCog. And I think that is going to have, and it is already being turned back into a consumer technology where you monitor the person's EEG to see if they are getting anxious or whether they're in a reflective state. And you don't, when you start to display knowledge to them or information to them that makes them anxious, you tone it down. You kind of narrow the parameters of what you're showing, and so this is research on the part of the DoD to try to figure out how wide a view you can give a soldier in the battlefield before you overwhelm them. And I think that's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. That is interesting stuff. It also, would give a military commander a snapshot of the psychological
of all
condition
of his soldiers.
of all of their soldiers, which on the one hand, I mean, this kind of brings us back to some extent into Gattaca territory, your favorite movie. On the one hand, right, it would be a useful thing to know. On the other hand, like part of what's valuable in a lot of contexts is sort of overcoming whatever psychological state you're in. Do you really want your military commander to know that you're anxious rather than being able to tell yourself that you can do what it is that you need to do in spite of being anxious? So there is a question of, I mean, not only privacy, which in some ways is a boring question, there is a kind of interesting moral psychological question of what the leader needs to know. Maybe it's better for him to pretend in his own mind, or them to pretend in their own mind, that all the soldiers are ready to go, and the soldier kind of it's their own struggle with themselves to overcome their anxiety. So it's not clear at which point, beyond the big brother weirdness of this mind reading, whether it's psychologically or even militarily useful.
Well, I'm just trying to imagine the situation. You're a grunt on the front line, and your generals just dumped a whole book on you and said, before you take your next shot, you have to digest this information. I think it's entirely appropriate to say, hey, I can't work with what you've given me here. It's not.
Yeah, I'm a grunt in the front line before an attack. I'm scared shitless, and I want to be left alone, being scared shitless, and talking to the grunt next to me, who's also scared shitless, rather than having the captain or sergeant come.
Yeah, it's still a problem on the battlefield, right? So you need to deal with the fact that they're a scared grunt, so somehow, and maybe drugs that help them not be scared is one of the solutions here, right? Which is part of the reasons people got drunk in the first place and went into battle.
Yeah, there's a non-military analog to this, which maybe makes the issue clearer, which is the kind of Moneyball version of this in sports. So, soccer players, I know Moneyball is in baseball, but since I can't stand baseball, I'll move to soccer. So soccer players are wearing these bra-like devices that transmit biometric information to the coaches, right, about everything from
concussion monitors in football helmets.
Yeah, and on the one hand, well, concussion monitors, there's a great argument for. The biometrics in soccer kind of make the game more mechanical and more quantified than it has to be. There is also such thing as too much technologically derived information, both in sports and in the army, I guess, is what I would say.
Why would it be too much? What makes it too much?
In sports, it takes get ready, because you're going to like this very much. It takes the magic out. It takes the wonder out. In the context of, I told you you'd love it. In the context of soccer, it makes it into a far more quantifiable, less human activity.
So you don't get to argue with the ref anymore. It's just we know exactly what happened on the field.
Yeah,
I have to stay out of sports, because I do not understand this weird world that you have all created of your made up games that you play with each other.
But I was just bringing up the sports analogy to try to clarify rather than to outrage you more, which in and of itself is fun. But I just think that you can also, I totally get there can be some very valuable aspects of BCI, brain computer interfaces, on the battlefield, like the ability to control technology better. When it comes to giving information about state of mind to commanders using the same interface, I have a problem with it. I mean, privacy is one part of it, but it's the smaller part of it.
Okay. We'll just have to agree to disagree. I think a lot of these questions come down to, well, we do it and then we see if it works or not. And if it doesn't work, we just don't do it anymore, right? If a general finds that, some particular innovation on the field is having a counterproductive result, they're not going to do it anymore. So, okay, fine. I don't think that's an ethical complaint.
Yeah, you can profoundly change the nature of war. I mean, I do want to go back to the sports analogy because I do think in a way it's instructive. The introduction of video assisted refereeing into soccer for many of its fans has actually qualitatively changed the nature of the game to be colder, less spontaneous, etc., etc. Now, I'm not saying that war has to be, beautiful to watch, fun, spontaneous. Don't get me wrong. I'm just wondering whether there can be an analogous argument here. I guess it goes back to what we were talking about, to some of the things that we were talking about before. Does a fully quantified, cognitively transparent version of war change the nature of the activity without us even noticing? At this point, I don't know. I'm raising that as a question.
Okay, let's talk about some more technologies. Germline and somatic genetic modification. Any thoughts?
Well, germline would mean that you are designing soldiers from babyhood. So that's a scary thought. So germline genetic engineering is the engineering of embryos in the very, very first stage in a way that would sort of go down it would go down the generations, every genetic change that you would make, and somatic engineering is engineering of adult cells.
I don't think that's what they were talking about in the report. I think they were imagining more engineering a soldier in a way that had germline consequences, but it would amount to the same thing. Those kids would then be super soldiers as well. So
right. So germline engineering in the context of militaries, that has a very, very significant yuck factor for me. Somatic engineering, I mean, look, if you are going to send soldiers into World War III and know that they're likely to encounter biological weaponry and there could be a somatic intervention put in through CRISPR that would make them immune to it, then by all means.
Right. Resistance to chemical and biological weapons, resistance to radiation. There's all kinds of things you could imagine there. The germline question, I think, okay, so for instance, resistance to radiation. If there were no side effects, no downsides, I don't see why you wouldn't want to pass on resistance to radiation to your children. But the question is determining side effects with multi-generational genetic interventions. So
right.
Okay, gut microbiome. I would put gut microbiome in the same category as exoskeletons because having so the idea here is you engineer a synthetic organism, usually E. coli or something like that. My daughter's roommate is currently working on this, engineering E. coli to produce GLP-1 agonists in the gut so that you wouldn't have to take your Zepbound or Ozempic shot. It would just, you would take, you would eat some yogurt every once a week that had these microorganisms in them, and they would do the same thing for you.
The thing in the context of war being what, like being less hungry so that you can go longer without eating, or like being less
that you could instead of jacking their genes or giving them a drug, that you could do the same thing somehow with engineered microorganisms. Again, I don't think that the well,
it depends what the thing is.
Right. Yeah. It depends on what the thing is. Right. Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that the two things can be, being less susceptible to dysentery and other kinds of diseases that are pretty common on the battlefield, right? So that would be one idea. Another would be to influence hunger so that you could be more efficient on the field. And the third would be to influence mood, which there's a growing body of literature on the gut-brain axis. So that seems like probably one of the least invasive enhancements.
Right, and one that can be clearly changed. It's not, it's not like you're going to be permanently affected by gut microbiome. Okay, so
one thing I did want to say, which we should talk about as good utilitarians, is that historically, a lot of the military technologies have been put to good civilian use. So many of the advances in battlefield surgery have become advances in regular surgery. Many advances in battlefield prosthetics became real life prosthetics. The urgency, yeah, and canned food, the urgency and figuring out microbiome enhancements might, accelerate research in those areas. So
Think of all the cool stuff we're going to get from World War III.
yeah, if we're around, if we're around long enough to see it. So that again, descriptively, has been a consequence of the development of military technology. GPS, which started as a purely military technology. It's not an enhancement, obviously, although maybe some will be put in people's brains soon enough. But
I don't know if it's an ethical question, but there is a kind of historical question about the utility and the consequences of war that they have not. They have accelerated human progress in certain ways, and one of the consequences is that they're one of the ways that society becomes more equal, both through universal conscription and the taxation of elites to conduct wars and so forth. So
yeah, and the experiment in World War II of women in the workplace and traditionally male roles, etc. Yeah,
gays finding each other in the services and.
Right. There's been several recent books making that kind of argument that wars are a social accelerant. I don't think it's not an argument for war. It's an argument that they have a silver lining.
Well, and it's probably not directly related to the question of enhancement. I think that it would still have that silver lining even if there were enhancements.
Yeah.
Okay, pharmaceuticals, exoskeletons, brain-computer interfaces, gut microbiome, genetic engineering, and then the other thing they talk about is enhancing our communication and integration on the battlefield. I think the artificial intelligence applications to war strategy and battlefield management.
It is interesting, by the way, how little we talked about AI in this conversation, and it's not. I think it's not by accident. In soldier enhancement, it has not yet proven to be that central. I think there is talk of systems that would allow for the faster integration of large amounts of information than we're capable of at the level of tactical commanders, so that you have some sort of display of synthesized information that you would have to rely on organic military genius and other, kind of contexts. But AI is much more relevant for autonomous weaponry than it is for the so far, at least, than it is for soldier enhancements, I think.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the OpenAI's 5 stages, they're currently at the stage of trying to turn chatbots into agents to make them actually do things, right? So that you could imagine that you could do things on the battlefield as well. If you see X situation, then autonomously do X. But they also imagine that the capabilities are eventually going to be at an organizational level, right? That you'll be able to replace multiple parts of an organization. So thinking about that, it's not that you necessarily are going to replace the soldier, but you could replace everybody between the soldier and the general as a kind of manager of the battle.
Yeah. No, that's right. I guess I just do want to sort of go back for a moment to something that we talked about in the very beginning, which is this language of the human being as platform, which on the face of which is very much front and center in this German-British report on soldier enhancement. And until now, platforms were like a tank is a platform that is susceptible for upgrades, and an armored personnel carrier and an airplane is a platform. And so there's this kind of mechanizing language of people as platforms. I guess, you're the transhumanist. My sense is that this just goes along with the territory, that you can't talk about human enhancement in the end without viewing humans as platforms, and you don't really have much of a problem with that because you're not a humanist in the first place. I'm not saying that. I mean, I like annoying you, but I'm not saying that to annoy you. I'm saying that as a conceptual. That seems to be the conceptual lay of the land, right?
Yeah, I think a transhumanist is comfortable saying that the body is a platform and that it's modulable, and that we should think about it that way. Yeah, I don't think if to the extent that I do find ineffable values in the world, it's not in the military context. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the pushback, which I'm not sure how committed I am to, but I enjoy making, the pushback is what gets kind of argued away from that picture is the notion of humans as inviolable, sacred, non-platform, and that in that sense there's something dehumanizing about the kind of preoccupation with enhancement.
You're saying it's okay that this person's job is to murder people, but we don't want to call them a platform because that would dehumanize them. That's your argument, Nir?
But in your universe, they're murdering people more effectively because of the bells and whistles that they have. So it's not like they're pacifist platforms, right?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm not a pacifist. I've agreed that we should put people out in the world whose job it is to kill people, and that sometimes people should be killed. And
yeah,
I don't.
Maybe it makes it easier to kill people though if you view them as platforms.
And I don't think that some pencil neck futurist calling your body a platform robs the martial valor from your defense of Western democracies in the battlefield.
You do but the history of technology is that we do start seeing ourselves in the technological metaphors that we use. We started seeing ourselves as computers. We're already starting to see ourselves as AIs. So now we're going to start seeing ourselves as weapon platforms. Does that have an impact? I mean,
maybe we'll start seeing our sexes as changeable, and dogs and cats will lie down together, and the entire world will fall apart. Why does seeing your body as potentially modulable be? I don't understand the whole argument that you're making about how it's somehow humanistic not to call a soldier a platform.
All right, with the cats and dogs, I think we can move to our news roundup before we completely deteriorate here.
Okay, so for the lightning round, we had talked about a couple different things. One is this high-profile case of a 14-year-old boy who started to use character AI and had a lot of mental stuff going on and eventually committed suicide. And his mother got a hold of the chat logs and have made them public that he was having sometimes erotic and sometimes psychiatric conversations with character AI.
Yeah, not only that, but the character AI chatbot, which I guess took a name out of Game of Thrones. That's right. So the chatbot sort of egged the boy on.
It didn't egg him on to commit suicide. It talked to him about his depression in ways that weren't necessarily helpful, but
yeah, there was some language there that was kind of like "come home to me" or something like that. I'm not. We should put the exact transcript up because I don't remember the transcript. What is certain is that there was no sort of pop-ups coming up and saying, "Are you, having dangerous suicidal thoughts? Here's a person you can talk to." There was no guardrail of either the most basic kind of ass covering, call this hotline, not even to speak of, maybe somebody supervising the chats that the thing could be flagged to, et cetera, et cetera.
We actually addressed this in Automating Therapy white paper we did last year. And when we talked about therapeutic apps versus non-therapeutic apps. And this is an example of a non-therapeutic app being used by somebody who needed therapy, and their policy response has been to increase the therapeutic sensitivity of the model so that it throws up more flags and warnings if someone's talking suicidally.
Yeah. So the mother, by the way, sued both Character AI and Google. Which I think Google bought Character AI, or why was Google?
Billions.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the character AI chief used to work for Google, left, and is now back. So they've been sued. That's going to be a very interesting case to follow. It definitely had interesting echoes of the Michelle Carter famous case of the young man who was sort of in that case, egged on in text by a girlfriend to kill
But
themselves.
but the difference here is that she actually tried to get him to kill himself, right?
Right. Yeah. And
And was
here,
human, not
yeah,
AI.
yeah. So that is a significant difference. I mean, it seems like the main issue here is that under these circumstances, some kind of warning should have been thrown out both to the kid and potentially to somebody outside
Right.
of the interaction.
I mean, I'm a liberal, but 14-year-olds having erotic sex chats is also a problem.
Yeah. I mean, we should do an episode about, well, we did an episode about therapy, but like there is a bunch of, about chatbot therapy, but there's a bunch of areas in which increasingly we're going to be having these kind of relationships with AI. Friends, lovers, teachers, therapists, dead people, and grief bots, and all of these cases are psychologically problematic and vulnerable contexts. So the technology is interesting, but you definitely need, like, it's an area that's calling out for regulation, my sense is.
Yeah, when you set up a summer camp or something and you're going to hire people to work with kids, you have to get a background check on them to make sure that they're not sex predators or terrible people. So you can imagine that we should have a similar set of protections about all the software that our kids are going to be interacting with.
Yeah. On a more optimistic note.
Well, the other, you mentioned two other things. One is Dario Amadei's Machines of Loving Grace essay, which is the latest techno-utopian manifesto out there.
Yeah. What'd you think about that?
Well, the one that you also mentioned, which I'm thinking in contrast to, is Tom Friedman's editorial about Harris and artificial intelligence in the New York Times. And Harris is basically saying, look, artificial intelligence is going to do a number on the world, and Trump has no idea what to do with this future. And Harris has been working on it. The Trump-Biden administration's been proposing things that could work on it. Let's do those things. And let's stick with Harris. Dario Amadei is the techno determinist on the other side and the techno utopian. He's saying it doesn't make any difference what happens in politics. The whole world could become fascist, but artificial intelligence is still going to give us, manna from heaven and cure all of our diseases, and
yeah,
in a very short period of time, like in the next 5 years.
Yeah, in the next 5 years, the large language models are going to advance from the level of mediocre undergraduates to Nobel Prize winners.
Well, you keep saying that you don't think that they're very smart, but the tests are showing that they can pass graduate level tests. That's what it's not that you would talk to it and think, oh, this is an actual.
I'm just repeating his point.
Yeah,
that's the kind of growth that you're. That you're gonna get. What it reminded me was more than anything, just in terms of historical context, it reminded me of Descartes' discourse on method, where he kind of talks about, right now our technologies might suck, but soon enough we'll be able to, get rid of diseases, get rid of death, get rid of poverty, and it's an old theme. It's an old techno-utopian theme with variation. It's there in Descartes. It's there in John Stuart Mill. It's, there in Dario Amodeo.
Okay.
Does he have evidence? I mean, I guess
philosophical question, Nir. Don't you think we're better off today than we were 500 years ago?
Yes. Well, this is our old debate about progress. Yes. Overall, I think we are better. I don't think that the line is as linear as you think it is.
So you agree that there has been an improvement in the human condition and that it's partly attributable to technology. You're just not sure that trend will continue.
I'm not sure how quickly it continues. I mean, I think it's hard to make a fully Luddite point without, while maintaining your intellectual integrity. Because, if I fall down on the way out of our conversation, I'm still going to go to the nearest emergency room and get an x-ray and then get a good orthopedist to fix my foot. That being said, I think that there's something to be said for the Rousseauian picture that every instance of progress involves an instance of regress. Quite often the progress is greater than the regress. I think people like you and Dario Amado never take the regress seriously. And so in that sense, I'm not fully a Luddite, but I am trying to convince you to take the 2 step forwards, 1 step back dynamic more seriously.
Well, again, that's my response to Dario Amado is pretty much the same, that he's all techno-utopianism and no downside. That's why I would contrast it with Tom Friedman, is that I think Tom Friedman is focused very much on the political moment, and I agree with his assessment of it. But in the long run, all the politics will probably be seen as secondary to the technological innovations that are happening. But I don't think that it's all going to be...
You agree with Amado on that?
I agree that technology, for me as a sociologist, technology establishes the parameters of what society can do. And then within that, people do all kinds of things within their technological parameters. And I think our technological parameters are changing very quickly.
But there are some technologies that operate within an existing conception of society, and then there's some very few technologies that completely change the conception of what a society is. Nuclear weapons is one that comes to mind. The other, I don't know if artificial intelligence is the other. I still haven't figured out. If Dario Amado is right, then we are headed to a very different conception of society very, very quickly, more quickly than we can process than we have now, right? If AI creates Nobel Peace Prize winning, Science Nobel Prize winning knowledge in the pocket of every person all the time, rather than having our halting conversation, we just, have 2 AIs do the podcast and we just stare into space.
At my staff meeting this morning, we were talking about how quickly our jobs were going to be automated, and yeah, I as someone who's soon to be leaving the paid workforce, I'm not as bothered by that as I used to be.
There you go. But it does go back to your question of like technology kind of setting social parameters. I think it's more complicated than that. It depends on the kind of technology, doesn't it?
Yes. This is this kind of complicated and nuanced question about the relationship between technology, progress, society. I don't think that there's an inevitable tendency towards progress. I think we've been pretty lucky. And I consider in general, the decline of infant mortality, the growth of literacy, women's equality, sexual freedom, everything that we've achieved in the last 500 years, I consider that progress on the basis of my values. And whether the trends that I consider progress will be furthered by future technological innovation, I'm not certain, but I'm also not certain that anything will necessarily get worse. And I think that's that kind of openness. When we were writing our essay about techno-realism and Ted Chiang. When we were writing that essay, this is a part of the question. Is it techno-realist? Is it techno-optimistic to say that it's possible that we could have Dario Amado's optimistic outcomes? Is that too optimistic, just to say it's possible and that we have to avoid these bad things out there? Or is it only techno-optimistic if you say it's inevitable that we're going to have the best?
Yeah, no, it's certainly possible. By the way, the examples of progress that you gave earlier are not all technological progress. Like women's rights is moral progress, right?
But it came about because of technological change in society. If we had not had the shift to industrialization and then post-industrial service economy.
So that's interesting. So for you, at the foundation of progress is technological progress, and moral progress is derivative from what we can do?
Well,
or they're not separate?
It's not that it's derivative. It's that technology determines what kind of society you're going to have. And within certain kinds of societies, what the Marxists would call mode of production, within a certain mode of production, you have more and less likely ways of arranging society, right? So that's the argument for why authoritarianism is common in water-based economies like rice paddies.
Gotcha. So it's a materialist argument in the end. And mine has to do with the imagination and self-invention.
When you look around the world, do you think that the reason women have more freedom today is simply moral progress and not industrial change?
I think a big part of it is, well, I think the real answer is an interaction of material change and industrial change with the moral imagination that could sort of ex nihilo see a world that wasn't there. So I think you need both of them for actual moral progress.
Well, I'll give you some. I mean, I agree with Pinker's assessment that the spread of Enlightenment ideas has been as important as some of the other things. You know, Pinker's argument for why we've seen progress over the last 500 years, that growth of government sizes is gotten bigger. That's, you know, I don't think many people think about that, but the larger the government, the less likely you are to have wars within that territory. So that's one of the reasons we have less violence today. And he thinks that our modern prosperity has contributed to that, which kind of relates to my argument. But yeah, I mean, it's not that I discount the spread of my values. I want those values to spread, but
yeah. So, but just to ask you a stupid question, do you think that AI is going to cure cancer like Dario Amadou does?
I think we're going to cure cancer. I'm not quite sure whether AI will be the thing that we finally say cured it. But yeah, we're very close, I think. I don't think there are going to be many physical ailments that will be beyond our capacities in a couple decades. You don't think so? You think we're all going to die?
I think we're just going to have new ones created by the wonderful things that we've done to solve the old ones. We're probably going to live longer in the process, Mr. Descartes. But yes, I do think that I do think we're all going to die.
Well,
going to continue dying.
The heat death of the universe is a tough nut to crack, so we'll have to come back.
All right, sir.
Okay, man.